Hello, bonjour, and welcome everyone. My name is Paul Keith, Business Advisor here at the World Trade Center, Winnipeg. I would like to begin today's webinar with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are gathered on the lands in Treaty 1 territory and that Manitoba is located on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Anishinaabeg, Innu, Dinasulane, and Dakota Oi nations. We acknowledge we're also on the homelands of the Red River Métis and that northern Manitoba includes lands that were and are the ancestral lands of the Inuit. The World Trade Center Winnipeg team respects the treaties that were made on these territories and acknowledges the harms and mistakes of the past and present throughout our nation. Thank you for joining our webinar, Doing Business in Canada, the Manitoba Advantage, which will be presented by David Enns of Economic Development Winnipeg, who will speak to Manitoba's advantages, and by Reese Patagon, Jessica Jensen, Desiree Katz, and Andy Chow from MLT Aikins, who will speak to the how-to of doing business in Manitoba. And before we begin, I first want to share a few housekeeping items. First, please send all of your webinar questions directly to the chat box at the top of your screen, and the team will try to answer as many as they can at the end of each section. For all logistical questions, please send them directly to the chat box, and I will answer your questions as soon as possible. And you will also receive the recording of this presentation within the next week. And now it's time to start our webinar. I would like to introduce you to our speakers today. From EDW, David Enns is the manager with Yes Winnipeg at EDW with a focus on the North American market. From MLT Aikins, Reese Patagon is a partner focusing his practice on Canadian corporate immigration. Jessica Jensen is a partner practicing in US and Canadian immigration law, with the ability to practice in Minnesota and North Dakota also. Desiree Katz is an associate who practices in taxation and corporate and commercial law. Andy Chow is an associate located in Vancouver, focusing on intellectual property law. And before we begin, we would also like to share a brief greetings video from Minister Jamie Moses, Minister of Business, Mining, Trade, and Job Creation. So I'm just going to share a video here from Jamie Moses.
I'm Jamie Moses, Minister of Business, Mining, Trade, and Job Creation here in the province of Manitoba. I'm so glad to be speaking with you today, and I want to let you know that Manitoba is open for business. We're the best place in all of Canada to do business. We have a wonderful and welcoming business community who's excited to make partnerships and support each other in business opportunities. We have some of the best labor and skilled workers anywhere in the country. And we also have a fantastic transportation hub where you can get your products to anywhere in North America within 24 hours. On top of that, Manitoba is a trusted partner, sharing values with companies right across the globe. We're excited to do business with you. Let us know how we can work together to make your business a success right here in Manitoba.
Welcome, everyone. I'm David Enns, the Foreign Direct Investment Manager for North America, and I'm really excited that everyone could join us here today. What you're seeing right here in the photo is one of the first national museums that was built outside of the capital of our country. It is the Canadian Museum of Human Rights, and in and of itself, it is worth the trip to come here to see this. So over the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'm going to talk about why Manitoba is the best place to invest. Based on some of the categories that you see here, I'll go into some of the more well-known sectors for Manitoba as well. So we'll start off with our location. So we like to think of Manitoba as the heart of the continent. As you can see, from east to west and north to south, we are centrally located. This gives us an advantage on many fronts. We have a center port. It's the largest inland trimodal port in North America, and that is air cargo, rail, and trucking. So we have 3 Class 1 railways. We have CN, CPKC, and BNSF. And we also have one of the largest trucking industries in Canada. Over 400 trucking companies are located here. And if you look to the north in this map, we have a small city called Churchill. And that's recently become very important. It's they're revitalizing the port of Churchill, which means now we can ship goods through the Arctic and to Europe. So that is definitely cutting down some time. This past summer, some shipments of some minerals made their way over to Europe. And down to the south, you can see we are connected all the way down into Mexico. The center port also has, it's 20,000 acres, and many thousands of those acres are shovel ready for your business. If you're from the United States, you may have seen the Minnesota license plate says 10,000 lakes. Well, here in Manitoba, we have over 100,000 lakes. And due to the abundance of water, we generate our electricity, our power, through this water, giving us one of the cleanest energy sources in North America. So we in Manitoba are fortunate to have 99% of our energy as clean energy. And not only that, it is the lowest pricing per kilowatt hour. So you can perhaps find your city or some other location you're familiar with and see the discrepancy in pricing from our electricity rates compared to those in, say, Boston or Calgary. So one of the more important things that companies, want to know when they're expanding into another jurisdiction is stability. So I'm going to go through some of the more well-known sectors here. In Manitoba, we have 9 large sectors, but I'll just be covering a few of them for today's presentation. One of the larger sectors is our advanced manufacturing. It's growing quite rapidly year over year and is one of our larger employment sources here in Manitoba. Some of the companies that you may be familiar with and may not be, so some of the world-class winter gear, Canada-U.S, is made here, right here in Winnipeg. And all the way from Pennsylvania to Hawaii, there's a good chance that your electrical bus or your natural gas bus is made right here in Manitoba through NFI, the New Flyer Industries. When you think of Manitoba, it's hard not to think about agriculture. It is well versed in our economy here. Lots of employees. Recently, we have a 5,000-acre innovation farm. So companies that are interested in setting up in ag tech or some of the value-added products that are associated with agriculture now have a location just outside of Winnipeg to test their products. Some of the larger companies that have moved to Manitoba, including Roquette from France. Also, Maple Leaf is a big player here in Manitoba, and if you like bacon, it has one of the only center of excellence in bacon right here. For creative industries, this is really about the filming industry and our gaming industry. And so this has been very fast growth we've seen in this sector year over year. And a lot of that has to do with the incentives that Manitoba provides. So we have some of the best tax credits, or we have the best tax credits in all of Canada. Up to 40% for our digital media tax credit. So that's really geared towards all of the gaming studios and services around that. And also film production. So we have lots of, Century 21 and Disney film productions, Fox, that take place here due to our very incentivized tax credit in film and video. So here's a few examples, including Ubisoft that expanded here into Winnipeg. What you might not know is how large our life science sector is, and we're actually ranked number 1 in medicament export. So that's just another way of saying medicine. And so we are also ranked 2nd in pharmaceutical manufacturing, and we have many associations and think labs in the life science sector. More notably, we have Emergent and Pfizer and Bosch and Health, which is out by Steinbach, a city of around 15,000 an hour away from Winnipeg. In terms of cost advantage, and when we're talking about industrial market rates, Winnipeg definitely comes in the lowest for the net asking rent. When you look, it's no surprise that Vancouver and Toronto are close to double, but Winnipeg definitely comes up on top in that area. And as I mentioned earlier, the incentives that Manitoba has is a big draw. So not only do we have our Canadian or federal incentives, on top of that, we also have our provincial incentives offered by the province of Manitoba. And so that can be from business expansion to workforce and training development. And we have an entire team here that also helps with the talent acquisition. Which leads me into one of the more important things that I hear time and time again when I speak with U.S. companies. They are seeking a highly skilled workforce, and no better place to find that than here in Manitoba. We have 3 universities here in Winnipeg. We have the University of Brandon as well as several technical colleges like the Red River College Polytech. And so a lot of these colleges work with industry to actually create the programs so that at the end, the students or recent grads are employed right out of school. Manitoba was the first to set up a provincial nominee program, and that's considered the gold star in Canada. It was so successful that many provinces decided to replicate what Manitoba had done in terms of the ability to have very high skilled employees from anywhere in the world come to Winnipeg and come to Manitoba. And lastly, the rates, the hourly rates. Manitoba, again, comes out on top. It is one of the lower median hourly wages. When you look at the quality of life in terms of housing, Winnipeg is substantially lower as well. The price of a home, a single family home in Vancouver or Toronto, is triple what it would be here in Manitoba. And this concludes my portion. You have my email there at the bottom right, and these slides will be shared with the attendees at the end as well. So that is it for me. Thank you for joining.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. I am Jessica Jensen out of Winnipeg with MLT Aikins. I am a U.S. and Canadian immigration lawyer, as we kind of chatted. I am just going to share my slides here right now so that we can get those up. Give me 1 second. Can everybody see those okay?
Looks good on my end.
I was going to say, I can't see it on my side, so who knows. Anyways, I am joined here by my colleagues, Reese Pactican, Desiree Katz, and Andy Chow. We are going to run through some scenarios about starting a business in Canada, specifically in Manitoba, and just some things that you might want to think about when preparing to do so. So my first slide, if I can get it to work properly, let's see if I can. There we go. Our first scenario, I'm going to read it out to you, and then I'm going to pose some questions to my colleagues, and they're going to get us some answers, and then we'll try to run through that as quick as we can, so we make sure we get you out of here on the hour. So scenario 1 for us today is a U.S. manufacturer, which we'll call U.S. Equipment, assembles and manufactures equipment in the U.S. for sale to its customers. The software to run the equipment and the mechanical systems in the equipment has been developed by U.S. Equipment in the U.S. and is custom to them. U.S. equipment has been contacted by a prospective Canadian buyer in Manitoba and needs to send one of their U.S. employees to Canada to negotiate the sale. After the sale, U.S. equipment will have their equipment shipped to their Canadian buyer. What are the issues this company has to deal with? And I'm going to pose my first question to Reese. From an immigration perspective, is there anything that the U.S. salesperson needs to do to enter Canada?
Not too much. If they're a U.S. citizen, if they're not a U.S. citizen, there might have to be applications for visas ahead of time. But generally, a U.S. citizen can come up. They'll want to be clear to a border services officer that they're having a sales meeting. They'll also want to be clear that the equipment and the software is manufactured in the U.S. because if they were selling a Canadian product, then the question is why don't you have a Canadian salesperson? But if it's U.S. made equipment and you're a U.S. citizen, you come up, you explain what the situation is. Maybe you have a letter. That's probably a good idea that talks about what you're going to do, and then you should be allowed into Canada to have those discussions and negotiations.
Awesome. Okay, and Andy, I'm going to come over to you next on this one. And if we assume that U.S. equipment has all the necessary U.S. patents, if U.S. equipment sells their equipment to a Canadian-based customer, does the fact that they have U.S. patents protect them at all, or vice versa?
Take myself off mute there. Thanks for the question. The short answer is no, they wouldn't have protection in Canada. And we're assuming here that they have U.S. patents. And we look to the U.S. patent statute in 35 U.S.C. 154 to see what rights are actually granted for the U.S. patent. And the statute says every patent shall contain a short title of the invention and a grant to the patentee, his heirs, or signs of the right to exclude others from making, using, offering for sale, or selling the invention throughout the United States or importing the invention into the United States. And it goes on. So the U.S. patent really gives rights in the United States, and then activity occurring in Canada cannot infringe the U.S. patent. The competitor, looking at a competitor of the company, they would not be able to manufacture in the United States and ship into Canada because that would infringe the U.S. patent. If there was no Canadian patent, the competitor might be able to manufacture in Canada or in another country where there's not patent protection, in China or somewhere in Europe, and then sell into the Canadian market without infringing the U.S. patent. So in terms of protection, if you want to exclude others in Canada, then you would want to apply for a Canadian patent, and there are strict timelines in terms of when that should be done. So speak with your patent attorney. Generally, there's a 1-year period after you've got your U.S. patent application filed that you can file in Canada. So there is that tight deadline. So thanks.
Awesome. Okay, Des, your turn. The equipment is sold to a Canadian customer, and U.S. equipment obviously needs their money. Are there any tax concerns here that might affect a pricing decision or any other concerns that you would want to raise?
Yeah, so first of all, notwithstanding that this is a U.S. manufacturer, if they are selling their equipment within Canada, they do need to charge the applicable GST and PST. With it being sold here in Manitoba, the GST would be 5%. That's similar all across Canada. And then in Manitoba here, it's an additional 7%. So tying that into the Manitoba advantage, that's one of the lower GST, PST rates that you'll see that 12% here in Manitoba. So minimal sales tax that you have to charge on that equipment. Other pricing considerations, U.S. equipment does not have a permanent establishment here in Canada. So it's not like we're transferring the equipment from the U.S. Equipment Corporation over to a Canadian corporation. If we were doing that, we may need to take into consideration transfer pricing, but that's not the case here. So really just Canadian sales tax is the big one. Generally, no import or no export tax would be payable, or import tax due to that GST and PST being charged on the equipment here in Manitoba. So not a big consideration, but always something to consider. Look into that. It might apply. It shouldn't. But yeah, that's about it there on that one.
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to try to move to my next scenario. Is everyone seeing scenario 2 there? Yep. Okay, good. A U.S. Service provider, which we're going to call U.S. Services, provides consulting services to clients and is now looking to offer their services to Canadian customers. A number of their services are offered remotely from the U.S. to Canadian-based customers, and customer data and consulting services are delivered across border via Zoom, Teams, email, phone, and occasionally by the physical delivery of packages. While most services are delivered remotely, from time to time, U.S. services, U.S. consultants need to travel to Canada. What are the issues this company has to deal with? And for this question, I'm going to start with you, Des, if you don't mind. We've got kind of a two-sided tax question for you here. What tax issues will the business face, and are there issues different in their services are offered, are these issues different if their services are offered 100% remotely from the U.S.?
Yeah, so I'm going to split this into two parts, like you said. One, the services being provided remotely from the US to Canada, and then the second is that employee coming to Canada from time to time to provide direct services. Both not too complicated of answers here, assuming that, okay, so first, with respect to those remote services, there's really no permanent establishment, no Canadian tax implications. Generally, I'm always going to say generally because that's how it goes with tax. We'd always want to know all the facts, but generally, if the services are provided online, so Zoom, video conference, Teams, whatever app you're using, and the employee is a U.S. employee, generally U.S. employment tax would apply, and then U.S. tax applicable to those services. No Canadian tax implications generally in that instance. And that's a question that I've had a lot of U.S. companies reach out to me recently because I feel like we're more and more in that online business. So I anticipate that there might be some changes coming with respect to that? Perhaps, because I hate to talk about COVID, but there's that pre-COVID era where we were doing all the traveling. We were coming to see our clients, and there would have been those Canadian tax implications if we were establishing a permanent establishment. Now we're in this post-COVID era where we've switched to Zoom, video conference, providing more of our services online, and we're in doing those services. We're not subject to Canadian tax for the most part. So I anticipate that might be looked at in the coming years. With respect to the individual coming to Canada, so there's a Canadian-U.S. tax treaty in place that says basically if there's no permanent establishment in Canada, then they won't be subject to Canadian tax. So we really want to look at the services that we're providing in Canada. Are we really just coming for a fleeting moment, one meeting? Then maybe we won't be subject to tax. But then also, so if that employee is coming frequently, if they're starting to do more in Canada, if they're really making that permanent establishment, they're bringing the corporation's ties over to Canada, then Canadian tax would apply in that instance. So here it's that permanent establishment that brings in those Canadian income tax implications. Right now, they're saying a virtual establishment is not a permanent establishment, but likely subject to change in the future would be my guess.
Awesome. Thanks, Des. Okay, Reese, over to you. I have two questions for you too. I'm going to ask them separately. I'm going to ask one first and then the next one. Do the U.S. consultants need any sort of Canadian visa or work permit to work remotely for the companies from the U.S.?
No, if the individuals are working outside of Canada, there's no Canadian immigration issue, no visa, no work permit that's needed to provide the services in Canada.
Okay, and what if they do want to come to Canada? Is there a visa or work permit needed in that situation?
So that becomes a little bit more complicated. The situation is, are you going to be working in Canada? And it doesn't really matter how long you're going to be here, whether you're going to be here for a day or a week. If you don't typically need something if you're coming just for a meeting, but a meeting is more talking about work than actually working. So, consultants, they'll say it's a meeting, but a lot of times it is actual work. And when you are coming to Canada to do actual work, there is really a three-step process you have to determine. The first one is, are you exempt from having to get a work permit? Um, and that could be because you're a highly skilled worker, typically at a professional level or a managerial level or an executive level. And even though you're providing services here, if you're coming up to Canada for under 30 days or under 15 days, depending on how often you're here, you can sometimes be exempt from work. A work permit, so it's not as complicated. If you're coming here to do work within a specific profession, let's say an engineer or a lawyer, or an architect or an architectural technician, that sort of a thing, then normally what you'd be ending up doing is coming and getting a work permit. And if you're an American citizen, you can get it right at the border, make the application there. There are some things you have to do beforehand, but that comes under the U.S., Canada, Mexico agreement, and the list of professionals there. So if you're coming up on a temporary basis, those are the options that we look at. If you're actually going to end up moving here, because you're going to, set up shop here, that becomes a different story. But generally, that's the process you have to analyze if you're coming up here to work.
Awesome. Okay, and Andy, over to you. If the U.S. company's product is software that remains in the U.S., i.e. it is hosted on the cloud in the U.S. and Canadian customers access it from their devices in Canada, is there anything the U.S. company needs to do to protect their intellectual property?
Yes, there certainly is, and when the services are being provided in Canada, the one of the key things to think about is your brand and your trademark rights. Now, as a U.S. company, you may have gone through the process and retained a U.S. attorney and even secured a U.S. trademark registration. Just as with patents, a U.S. trademark registration is not going to protect you in Canada in your brand. So when you come into Canada and now you're offering your services in Canada in association with the brand, there are really two questions for trademarks. Question number one is it available to use? Is it available to use, meaning that when I start using it, is someone else going to commence an action to sue me and stop me from using it and claim damages? And so that other user, the third party user there, they may have common law unregistered trademark rights in Canada, or they may have obtained a Canadian trademark registration. And so we can do some searching to see whether there are other owners of that brand or a confusingly similar brand in Canada to see whether it's available to use when you expand your services into Canada. Question number two is registrability. So if you wanted to obtain a Canadian trademark registration to give you protection across the entire country, there's a separate question of, is the trademark registrable in Canada? And that may have other considerations. In terms of registration, if you do want to protect your Canadian trademark, your trademark across the entire country, I'd recommend filing as early as possible. There is a substantial backlog of Canadian trademark applications awaiting examination. Canada joined an international treaty called Madrid in 2019, and it's led to a flood of filings in Canada. The Trademarks Office is currently filing, if you don't fit under one of these specialized categories and you're a regular trademark application that didn't choose from a pick list of pre-approved goods, it's a 3.5-year wait to get to examination. So if you know your business is going to be offering services in Canada, I'd recommend engaging a Canadian trademark lawyer as early as possible and getting your Canadian trademark application filed.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, we're moving on to our third and final scenario, and then we will save some time for questions at the end here. Double check my slide. Okay, scenario 3. After a few months, U.S. equipment and U.S. services have found so much success in the Canadian market that they realize that the best way for them to grow is to expand in Canada, where the majority of their revenue comes from. Their new structure sees the company splitting work amongst employees in both countries, such that design and consulting work are now done by teams located on both sides of the border. On the manufacturing side, equipment manufacturing starts in the US but is finished in Canada. What sort of issues do the US companies and US employees have to consider when setting up Canadian operations? Okay, Andy, I'm coming right back to you. Sorry about that. With full-blown operations in Canada, what sort of processes need to be added to protect the company's intellectual property?
So again, you're full blown into Canada now. Canadian IP rights should be kind of top of mind, and you should be going through it with your legal advisor here. Things to consider in addition to the patents and trademarks, which we've already discussed, is copyright. Are there some types of important works to the business that you may want to secure Canadian copyright registrations over? You don't need a copyright registration in Canada to commence an action for copyright infringement, but there are some benefits. So if you believe that competitors, there may be a risk that they may be reproducing certain works that your company owns, then look at securing copyright protection. There's also industrial design protection in Canada. In the United States, those are known as design patents. So we have that form of protection. There are as with patents, tight restrictions on the timing of filing industrial designs. So work with your attorney. Keep those new designs that you're developing secret and confidential until you speak with your attorney if you do want to obtain protection in Canada. The other thing to take a look at is your non-disclosure agreements and your IP ownership clauses with employees, with contractors, and take a look at, there's no trade secret legislative protection in Canada. So take a look at what your trade secrets are and what types of security measures you have in place to protect those trade secrets. Basically an overview of the different forms of IP that might apply to your business and making sure that you have the proper protections in place in Canada.
Awesome. Okay, Andy, I'm coming back to you for another question. If some of the software and equipment is partially developed in the U.S. and then partially developed in Canada or vice versa, how can the company make sure that their intellectual property is protected on both sides of the border?
Canada is a member of a number of international treaties, as I mentioned, for trademarks, for patents, for industrial designs, for copyright as well. So whether you're working directly with a Canadian attorney or with your U.S. attorney, if you're a U.S.-based company, you can discuss when deciding your Canadian filing strategy, whether you want to utilize one of these treaties, depending on the IP. In terms of assignments of rights, make sure you get worldwide assignments, not just the U.S. assignments of rights, if you want the Canadian rights assigned as well, and your attorney can assist with that. And then for patents, there are some countries that have what's called it's a foreign filing license. So in the United States, if the invention has been created or developed in the United States, then you do need to have permission from the U.S. government in order to file outside of the United States. And that's done typically by filing a patent application in the United States first, and then the USPTO will grant this license. And it's to protect, for example, military inventions and things of national security. So if there's going to be inventors on both sides of the border and possibly the creation of the invention in the United States, then speak with your U.S. attorney. You may need to file in the United States first or obtain that foreign filing license from the USPTO before filing into Canada.
Last one, Andy, I promise. Sorry. Last question for you on this slide anyways. Is there anything the company needs in their contracts with their employees to protect their intellectual property from theft in that regard?
Definitely make sure you have IP ownership clauses, and I'd recommend this with any of your employment agreements, but certainly with contractors that you're working with, as typically when a contractor is developing some form of IP, the ownership of that IP right will stay with the contractor absent an agreement otherwise. So you do want to make sure that you've got IP ownership clauses thought out in any contractual relationships. In Canada, there's moral rights as well for copyright. Moral rights can't be assigned, but they can be waived. So you want to make sure that there's a waiver of moral rights for any works that your contractors or your employees are creating. And then confidentiality provisions are important, especially for patents and for designs. The disclosure of those can lead to the loss of rights, or in Canada, the United States, in our laws, we have a grace period as well. So if you disclose that, there may be a deadline to actually file a patent application or industrial design application. So having confidentiality provisions in place anytime you need to disclose sensitive business information or designs or new inventions.
Awesome. Okay, Des, over to you. What kind of business structure should the company consider, and what are the corporate tax implications of each structure?
So there's lots of different structures that we could consider here. generally the two when U.S. companies are coming into Canada that we consider are establishing a subsidiary. So that is a Canadian corporation, but that Canadian corporation would be wholly owned by the U.S. corporation. So if we're earning income in Canada, it's taxed in Canada. If we're earning income in the U.S., it's taxed in the U.S., but we have to consider how we're repatriating income across the Canadian-U.S. border. Usually with a corporate structure, it's simplest because we can, if you know how dividends taxed, if two corporations are connected, a dividend is usually transferred. We like to say tax-free, but it's through a series of refunds that the dividend can be transferred tax-free from one corporation to another. When it goes across the border, there's some tax payable, generally a 15% tax, but it's very minimal, that 15% tax if we're repatriating funds from the U.S. to Canada, Canada to the U.S. A lot of times the repatriation of that funds is called excess surplus rather than a dividend, subject to that 15% tax going across the border. Another way corporations like to establish in Canada is through a branch. So that is not setting up that Canadian subsidiary corporation. They just have a branch, more so, I hate to use the word partner because that's a different form of entity, but it's just having that branch of your U.S. services in Canada, no formal Canadian ownership structure, like no corporation established. Generally, that's not tax advantageous for transferring funds across the border because with that branch, you don't have that corporate structure, so you don't have the connectedness, and therefore you'd be subject to a lot higher tax when you're repatriating funds across the border. If there was some way that you could have a U.S. like the U.S. corporation and the Canadian corporation, and rather than having that Canadian subsidiary controlled by the U.S. corporation, have some sort of Canadian control, Canadian investment in that Canadian subsidiary, you'd be able to take advantage of a lot more of the tax incentives that we have here in Canada. So maybe partnering, again, the word partner, I always use it, but I don't want you to establish a partnership. That's not what I'm looking for here. I want you to find somebody that you can, for lack of a better term, partner with in Canada, so you can get the status of a Canadian controlled corporation, because then you can take advantage of all those great tax credits that we have in Manitoba. We have like SR&ED credits for like science, research, design, innovation. There's manufacturing credits, but unfortunately, a lot of those credits are, they do require that Canadian control piece. So we can still have the U.S. corporation and the Canadian corporation, the border, but having that Canadian control over here allows us to take advantage of those tax incentives. And then still we would have that connectedness status to repatriate funds across the border. So I think that's generally the most tax advantageous structure that I advise my clients to set up. Corporation, Canadian controlled, US controlled.
Okay, awesome. Let's talk about money for a quick second then. If the company needs to move more money from the US to Canada, to their Canadian operation, sorry, is there a tax concern here?
Yeah, so that's when we get into that excess surplus. So well, it really depends how we're moving the funds. Are we loaning the funds? Do we just have excess funds in the U.S. that we want to repatriate to Canada more so as a dividend to pay out to our shareholders? There's different considerations based on how we're repatriating the funds. Yeah, so there's a lot of questions, like what do they need those funds for? Is it really just a loan? Are we repaying it? If it's a loan between related corporations, we generally want to have a prescribed rate of interest charged. And then, or the other thing that I'm going to add on to your question there, Jess, rather than just repatriating funds, let's talk about the movement of the equipment across the border. So that is where I previously talked about transfer pricing. that's where transfer pricing considerations come in. So we can't be moving our equipment generally across the border because the governments always like to think the worst of us, and they think that we're going to take our equipment from or our funds from a high tax nation and move them over to a low tax nation. So what transfer pricing is in a nutshell is it says that when we're moving equipment from one corporation to the next, and we're connected corporations, we have to charge generally with some discounts, some items come into the transfer pricing calculation, but what we would charge an arm's length entity for that equipment, because we don't want to be seen as taking equipment, other manufactured goods from that high tax nation to a lower tax nation. So we consider transfer pricing when moving items across the border.
Okay, last question for you. I like all these last questions right at the end of the spectrum here. So for Americans working in Canada or Canadians working in the U.S., with these folks moving back and forth with related entities, will these employees pay income tax in both countries?
Oh, so we're having Canadians go work for the U.S. entity and the U.S. Okay. Well, ideally, we would have the Canadians work for the Canadian entity and be taxed in Canada, and the U.S. Individuals work in the U.S. for the U.S. entity. That would be the easiest for the business because the U.S. employees would be taxed in the U.S. and the U.S. entity would do the applicable withholding tax, make the applicable remittances with respect to that U.S. person. And we would hopefully have our Canadian employees employed by the Canadian operation. Again, withholdings, remittances, all of that would be from the Canadian entity. If we're having Canadians moving back and forth across the border, we need to take into consideration, like, how long are those employees staying in the U.S.? What services are they providing in the U.S.? Are they providing services in the U.S. to the Canadian entity, or are the services that they're providing in the U.S. to the U.S. entity? So there's a lot of questions that come into play there. And generally, like, we would want to look at each employee's case on, like, one by one. So no employee would be the same. So anytime I have a client that has those two operations, and they have often now, like we're in this post-COVID remote world, we have those employees that want to go work for the U.S. entity for 4 months. They look outside today and it's all blustery and cold, and they say, no, I'm going to go work in Palm Springs. Like, U.S. corporation has a Palm Springs establishment. That's where I'm going to go for 4 months. And so I always ask the entity, like, who's continuing to pay, who's continuing to do the withholding, what type of tasks is that individual doing in the U.S. And same thing on if that U.S. employee was coming to Canada. I don't know why they would on a day like today, but if we had a U.S. employee coming to Canada, are they providing services to the Canadian entity? Who's doing their payroll, withholding, their remittances? And so it, again, it goes back to that permanent establishment and the degree of services provided. If the Canadian employee is providing a substantial amount of services in the U.S., if they're there for a significant period of time, if their services are to that U.S. entity, yes, the U.S. entity, unfortunately, will need to withhold in the U.S., remit in the U.S. With respect to that employee, and that U.S. employee would likely need to register for with the IRS to pay their income taxes in the U.S. And then they would also need to pay their income taxes in Canada. Luckily, like we've mentioned several times today, Canada and U.S. have a treaty. So generally, if you've overpaid in the U.S. And in Canada, like, it all works out. But you just need, in order to take advantage of that treaty, you do need to properly file in both the U.S. and Canada if you have filing obligations in both countries. If if you actually have US filing obligations, but you've only filed your Canadian taxes, but you were withheld in Canada due to like the corporation thinking that they had to pay the US, you won't be able to take advantage of the treaty because you did not properly file. So with respect to that, I say always get your tax advisor to do an analysis of the individual specific situation. Get your tax accountant to look at it as well. And those would be when I do these types of analysis. If it's a cross-border employee, I'm working with US counsel as well. So we got Canadian and US tax and legal on both sides. And just making sure that that the employee properly understands the situation. And then again, ensuring that the employee is dealing with proper advisors as well. So if you previously had your employee who was always filing their own taxes or just going down to their H&R block, maybe you need to recommend a nice cross-border accountant that could assist them with this type of situation.
Awesome. Okay, Reese, I am coming over to you.
Just first, it looks like there's someone with a question, and I think we have until 1:30 today. So maybe we should just take that question in case it's not an immigration question, it's a tax question.
Sure, it's not showing up on my side, so why don't you call on them? And
Yeah. Beirut, sorry if I'm saying your name wrong. You come off mute if you want to ask your question.
Hello, everyone. I have a question about the startup program in Manitoba. We have a startup program in Manitoba with the other firm, but unfortunately, we have about 3 years in the IRCC progress. I want to know if it's possible to find a way to the shorter than we take a letter of support from Manitoba Technology Accelerator in Manitoba, and our project also we have a plan to start in Manitoba. But I and another friend know we are in Canada, but three guys is not take a visa yet. I want to know how can take a shorter time for the startup visa.
The answer is you can't. There's no, unlike in the United States, where there is an expedited visa program in some immigration statuses, the Canadian startup visa doesn't have anything that can move the process faster. It's simply whenever immigration gets to the application. So that's the unfortunate answer. There's nothing that you can really do to speed up that visa program. And that for other people on the call, that's a program that allows for people who want to do startup companies to immigrate to Canada. And then there's another question
I was
as
going to
well.
say, I'm seeing a second question there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, we had another question earlier on in the chat. We can save it till the end if we like, if we want to wrap up the scenario first, because it's more broad, not specific to this. But we do have a hand that just went up, though. I can't see the name for some reason. I see the initials.
CN, yeah.
CN. Chigozi. There, it came up. Perfect. You come off mute if you like.
Okay, thank you very much. I quite found the presentation by the gentleman from Economic Development Winnipeg quite interesting. And I didn't quite get the name. He's been introduced before I joined, and I have a question for him. I work with immigrants that are looking to own businesses in Manitoba, and foreign businesses, especially from Africa, that are looking to exploring market entry opportunities, expansion and green sort of a greenhouse investment. I'm wondering if there are some like trade visit programs that they can channel them, take advantage of towards their interest to establish in Manitoba, or maybe more access to information like some portal with resources that gives further details about doing business in Manitoba.
So Reese, do you want to finish the scenario question first and add like a tab onto your questions at the end just to talk about other options for investing in Canada?
Sure, but maybe you can let David jump in on this question because I think David, you have an answer to this, right?
Just kind of a very short answer in terms of if I understood it right. Looking for kind of a mission trip from, I think you mentioned Nigeria, where several businesses would come to Manitoba to see what the opportunities are. And yes, we do help with that, especially with site selection. So depending on the companies that are coming here, we coordinate those types of visits quite often. But we could always talk after and kind of further develop that out. Thank you for your question.
Appreciate that.
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to bring us just back to the scenario just because we're going to talk through some of the immigration options that kind of come with the U.S. equipment and services that we've been talking about thus far. So as a reminder, the scenario we are talking about now is that we have expanded into both countries. We have operations sort of in both countries, and we're moving along quite nicely with the expansion into Canada. So Reese, why don't you walk us through some of the visa and or work permit options that folks would need to explore in order for their employees to come from the U.S. to Canada to work in Canada?
Okay, so when you've got U.S.-based employees and you need to send them to Canada for work, the first question that we always ask as immigration lawyers is, what is the citizenship of the employee? If they're U.S. citizens, they have a different pathway and usually an easier pathway in many cases. If they're not U.S. citizens, then sometimes the pathway is a little bit more elongated and takes a little bit more time. So if you've got a green card in the U.S., usually that's not too much of an issue. You can usually move quickly, but sometimes that can be. If your employee is a U.S. non-immigrant, then that can be much more time consuming, and the pathways to come to Canada may be different as well. So that's the first thing. The second thing that we look at is the job duties of the person that's coming here. And so it's not just the job title, because that's important, but it's the actual duties, because the job duties will tell us what immigration programs are available for the individual to come here. Can they come here using that 15 or 30-day exemption that we spoke about if they're coming here for a short time? Should they get a longer term work permit that could allow them to live in Canada for years, maybe 3 years, maybe more, or come back and forth to work in Canada over a 3-year period? American citizens have a list of professions that they can qualify for under the U.S. Canada-Mexico agreement. Non-U.S. citizens, there are other treaties that they might qualify under. And then there's also special programs for long-term workers here if you're coming here in a technology occupation. So the job duties are really quite important as to what is needed here. It also goes to whether there can be an intra-company transfer. So you've got employee in the United States who then wants to be transferred here. If they're a long service employee of at least 1 year in the United States, then usually they have a faster way to get here. The intra-company transfer doesn't work for everybody. You can't have every single employee transfer to Canada, but you can have the executives, your managers, your specialized knowledge workers come here. There are also a couple of other a little bit more niche programs that might apply depending on who's coming up to work in Canada. Individuals who speak French relatively fluently, there are special programs for them. That's not going to be applicable in a lot of places in the U.S., but I mean, if you're coming up from Louisiana, you're coming up from, you're a Mainer, you're someone from Vermont who speaks French, then you can take advantage of those types of programs. You don't have to be born in France. I mean, if you actually lived in Tucson, Arizona, and you decided you wanted to learn French and you did, that program will work for you as well. And there's also some programs that are available for individuals with American Indian status. in the United States who can come up. Not everyone that has American Indian status can come and work in Canada, but a number of individuals can. So that's something that if you have status as an American Indian or your employee has status as an American Indian, that's something that we can look at in terms of coming up here. So that's when we're looking at bringing people up here temporarily to work. If people want to settle here, so you've got employees who want to settle here, maybe by themselves or with their families, then we have to have a different conversation. Normally, what you do is you try to get a temporary work status so they can work here in the interim period. But then we need to look at whether there are various programs for permanent residency, because not every program that allows a person to work temporarily can bridge into permanent residency. And when we look at that, there's a specific program that Manitoba has, and David mentioned it, it's called the Manitoba Provincial Nominee Program. So you should look at eligibility that way. There's also a federal program called Express Entry that allows you to immigrate to any province in Canada and any territory in Canada except Quebec. So you can use that for Manitoba as well. So if the plan is, I need to send someone here for a short-term period, then that is assessed differently than I need to have someone move here. Because if you want to have someone move here, you want to make sure that you cover both of those things off. The other thing that you have to cover off when you're moving employees to Canada, even though it's an immigration question, is there's a requirement to comply with Canadian labor and employment laws. There are representations employers have to make regarding that. So you really should understand the differences between employment laws in Canada and in the U.S. One of the big things is Canada is not an at-will, and Manitoba and most Canadian provinces aren't at-will jurisdictions for employment. So that will be a different way that you have to treat employees. One of the immigration requirements is that employers provide a workplace that's reasonably free of abuse. So if there are no requirements for that expressly in a U.S. state or territory, then you might actually need to develop a specific policy in order to comply with that aspect of things before the immigration work permit or visa is issued to the employee. So that is a general overview of where we're at on the immigration pieces, Jess.
Thanks. And I'm going to throw one more rogue question at you here, Reese. Can you give us a little bit of an idea of what the immigration in Canada has looked like over the last several months, some changes that you expect, and what, if anything, can folks do to get ready early for immigration processing if we think they're going to take a little bit longer than they have in the past?
So the immigration system in Canada has gotten a bit tighter. Canada has reduced the number of people that they will be allowing to come in as both permanent residents and temporary residents. It shouldn't affect Americans coming to work temporarily so much. The biggest thing that might affect Americans coming in to work temporarily is the scheduled review of the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement that's supposed to come in a couple of years. There are a lot of immigration categories that allow Americans to work in Canada under that agreement. And if those are changed, that can either expand the ability of Americans to work here or it can contract them. So that's one thing that you have to be mindful of. And that's a bigger piece, obviously, than just immigration. There is still a Canadian program that allows for the expedited bringing in of tech workers. And what we find is we've acted for a number of companies over the years who have set up either their back office tech operations in Canada or have set up, full-blown operations here because of the inability or the restrictions on bringing in tech workers into the United States and sometimes other workers. And so that option, even though a little bit more restricted now than it was a year ago, is still available where you can set up back office operations in Canada, the tech operations in Canada, if what you're looking for is bringing in people from, Asia and Africa and the Americas, and you can't get your visas to work in the U.S. So that's something that other people might still be looking at, and that's still a relatively viable option. The other thing that we've seen, and Jessica, I know that you've gotten the calls as well, is even though the immigration system is getting a little bit more restricted, there are some concerns with some Americans about living in the United States subsequent to the presidential election. I'm not too sure exactly how all of that works with the politics there. But what we've found is that there are a number of American citizens who have, some Canadian lineage. And one thing that if you do have, Canadian family in your background, you might actually have a claim for Canadian citizenship, or you might actually be a Canadian citizen right now. You just don't have the document that proves it. And if that's the case, then that makes it a lot easier to work in Canada, because once if you're a Canadian citizen, then there's no restrictions on the ability to work.
Awesome. Okay, and so the only thing I'm going to cap this conversation off with, at least from the immigration perspective, is make sure you ask these questions early, because everything is getting a little bit tighter, because things are getting a little bit more complicated all kind of across the US and Canada. We highly suggest asking these questions at the beginning. The same with, I'm sure Des will tell you about the tax considerations, and I'm sure Andy will tell you about any of the IP considerations. So ask these questions early if you are, planning on getting set up in Canada and in Manitoba specifically. We are happy to answer any of those questions you might have. But for the purposes of ending the presentation, or getting to at least the question period of this one, I am going to maybe switch our slide over just to our contact information, just so that you have it all there. That is all of our emails, direct emails. That is all of our phone numbers and links to our website so that you can find us. But with that, unless Des or Andy, you have any other thoughts that you want to add at the end here, I will open it up to questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much for all the information, just chock full of info, which is fantastic. Just a quick note. So I got a few questions written down. If you have any questions, put them in the chat, put your hand up. I shared some upcoming events that we're putting on, just in case you are here in Manitoba and any of them are of interest for you. So Desiree, I did have a question for you. So do you recommend, when you're talking about the incorporations, that most US companies, when they go to set up an incorporation within Canada, to federally incorporate and then do the extra provincial registration, or a provincial incorporation? Or does that really depend? It probably depends on, anything you're mentioning on the nature of the business, right?
Yeah, so that's a question that I get for not only US companies coming into Canada, but any new company that's being established here, whether or not to incorporate federally or provincially. So really it depends on where you're doing business. If you're doing business all across Canada, I recommend a federal incorporation. And again, you'll have to register your business extra provincially everywhere as well. If you are just planning on having your business operations here in Manitoba, then have a Manitoba corporation, because you don't need to, on top of that, register extra provincially to operate your business in Manitoba if you're incorporated here. If you do have that federal incorporation, you will have to have that extra provincial registration in Manitoba. And also, a lot of times, individuals coming into Canada, sometimes it's buying an existing business. And so if you're buying an existing Manitoba business, sometimes you're buying that through a purchaser corporation. Generally, if the existing business is a Manitoba corporation, we'd want the purchaser corporation to be a Manitoba corporation, because we'll probably amalgamate those immediately post-close. And so rather than going through an extra step to continue that corporation somewhere, we can easily amalgamate those companies. So really, it's a question that comes up a lot. And so you want to look at any existing structure, where you're operating, and those are really the main considerations. But yeah.
Okay, no, great. Thank you.
Paul, let me jump in on that question as well. One thing that happens in Manitoba and in the federal incorporation is there's these old archaic rules in Manitoba and federally that require directors, a minimum number of directors to be a resident of Manitoba, or a minimum amount of directors if it's federal to be a Canadian citizen. It's not too much of a problem setting up in Manitoba if you've already moved a person here and they're resident here. The immigration status doesn't matter. They can be a director. But sometimes you get situations where the directors really should be the folks in the U.S., the senior people in the U.S., they want to be the directors. And there's no real ability to put a Canadian director on because they really don't know anyone here and they certainly don't want to make them a director of a company. In those situations, because of the peculiarity in Manitoba law, a lot of times we'll incorporate the company in another Canadian jurisdiction, like where Andy is he's out in Vancouver. A lot of times we'll call Andy's office and say, hey, can you set up the BC corporation? And then we'll just register to do business in Manitoba. So it's little things like that that you have to be aware of because you could, run yourself afoul of a Manitoban corporation law accidentally. And, it's a little bit annoying, but there's an easy workaround, and that's the workaround that we will look at.
Awesome. Great additional insight. Thanks for sharing that, Reese. We had a question earlier, and I think Shirley did have to leave, but I thought it was still a good question. Probably going to get a lot of different insights and opinions on it, which is great with our panel here. But she asked, how will the projected tariffs impact doing business in Canada? Whoever wants to just bite
it'll
into
make it
that
more
one.
It'll make it more expensive.
Yeah.
The tariffs, I think that Trump has indicated in the last couple of days are talking about a tariff on goods coming from Canada to the U.S. So it really depends on what goods they're imposed on. And if all of a sudden there's a 25% tariff on a good that you're producing in Manitoba that you want to ship to the U.S., that's certainly going to change your pricing. But if you're looking at importing stuff from the U.S., it depends on what Canada does in retaliation. If Canada puts I think the last time we had this little tariff war with the Trump administration, Canada put tariffs on Harley Davidsons, so they could hit Wisconsin a little bit, and it was tactical. So if that's the case and you don't drive a motorcycle, I think you're okay. But if you do, then maybe you get your Harley now, that sort of a thing. But I think that's what the tariff piece looks like to me. I don't know what my other colleagues are seeing.
Yeah, so from a tax perspective, I haven't seen anything proposed to, I guess, retaliate from a Canadian perspective with respect to the proposed tariffs. I agree with Reese that it may increase the cost of goods here in Canada because that additional tariff will be charged when we're exporting. But otherwise, I haven't seen anything in particular.
Yeah, and for the IP perspective, I don't see it really changing your filing strategies. If you're going to be making and selling your products on both sides of the border, then you want to have proper IP protection on both sides of the border.
Some great. David, I actually had a couple questions for you. I could probably tie two of them in together. So something that came to mind is what, in your experience and from your day-to-day, what would you say are some of like the underrepresented aspects of doing business in Manitoba? And then I guess the second part would be, what you alluded to some of them during your brief presentation, but like what are some exciting things coming down the pipeline here in Manitoba?
For sure. So I think one of the more underrated topics is really about site visits, making sure that people are actually here in Manitoba when they're deciding to, expand their operations from the U.S. While we tend to think that we're very similar in a lot of ways, it is always a good idea to see things firsthand. So that's the first part. The second part is what we're seeing right now is a lot of interest in the kind of secondary, tertiary, electric vehicle battery world. So we're getting a lot of interest in that. Manitoba is very fortunate we are a very resource rich province. So that's resources, natural raw, but also our talent. So definitely with our new mineral strategy, we expect to see a lot more interest in that coming from not just the US, but other parts of the world as well.
Awesome. No, that's great. Okay. There were no more questions that popped up into the chat. So if anyone has questions, we did schedule till 1:30. So if you do have questions, please ask, put your hand up. The panelists, if you have any additional insights that you want to share, maybe, briefly touch on, kind of wrap things up a little bit, that would be great.
Well, I just wanted to say what Jessica mentioned just a few moments ago. When you're crossing an international border to do business, you really should plan things ahead. Jessica and Des and Andy and I, we've all seen situations where someone starts doing business in Canada, in Manitoba or another province, and then they say, "Oh, what about my patent?" Or "How do I get my employees here?" Or "Oh my gosh, do I have to pay tax?" And that really isn't a pleasant conversation to have with the client when you're there at that stage. So you really want to talk to your advisors. You'll have local counsel, you'll have local accountants and those types of folks that can help you out. But you really need to talk with people here in Canada. And Manitoba is one jurisdiction. We have 10 Canadian provinces and 3 territories, and much like U.S. states, the laws in each jurisdiction can be a little bit different. So be careful about talking with a lawyer or an accountant that might be licensed in one province when you're trying to do business in another one, because you might get the wrong answer. And if you get the wrong answer, that can be, fairly costly. I mean, we've had situations where someone thought that they didn't need a work permit to work here. I couldn't figure out why. And then all of a sudden, enforcement is knocking on their door to throw the guy out of the country. And again, that wasn't a pleasant conversation to have with a client when someone's knocking at their door. But at that point in time, it was something that could have easily been taken care of, months before, and it wouldn't have been a costly fix. And some people just don't know, and then they do that, and then it just becomes a disaster. I'll tell you, it makes it interesting for us lawyers because you get these like interesting fact scenarios that you only got in law school, but my gosh, it's just not a pleasant situation.
And then it costs more money to fix.
Yes.
So if you ask those questions in advance, a lot of the time we can save you not only time, but also money in trying to sort those issues out.
Awesome.
Yeah. And I would just expand on what Reese said. And from a tax perspective, the answers are unfortunately, fortunately, it's either no, you didn't need to pay tax, everything was fine, like in that Zoom scenario that we talked about, or it's oh no, you do owe a lot of taxes and you should start reporting, and what are the back taxes going to be, and what are the consequences, and what is the CRA going to do for the fact that you've been doing business in Canada and haven't been paying the applicable tax. So it's either no, you don't owe any tax, or you owe a lot of tax and the situation is not good. So let's try to not get into one of those situations and just contact somebody before you come to Canada and make that decision to start doing business here in Manitoba. And then again, like we talked about, there might be tax credits available to you that you otherwise wouldn't be aware of, and advantages that are only available to doing business in one province. We hope Manitoba over another province. And so we want to talk to you about those and how we could save you on your taxes here and the advantages of bringing your business here to Manitoba.
Awesome. I had another question pop to mind, Desiree. This might be for you. As a U.S. company, maybe attending a trade show, they have a booth set up, say somewhere in Canada. Can they make and finalize sales here? And if they can, like, what should they be doing in order to, make sure they're doing that properly?
So making and finalizing sales in Canada is one of the indicators of a permanent establishment in Canada. So that's not something that we'd want them to be doing here. At a trade show, they can talk about their business, really promote themselves, but making and concluding those sales, we wouldn't want that done at a trade show without the proper visas in place, because like I said, you have that permanent establishment, and once you have that permanent establishment, you have Canadian tax obligations. So yeah, really make sure you just set up that booth and put on a nice smile, talk about your business, and not much more unless, and if you do want to be concluding sales at that trade show, give us a call. We'll make sure that everything's in place so you can do so.
And Paul, on the immigration piece, if you are at a trade show and you're making sales, one of the things you can't do if you're an American is actually deliver the product at the trade show. So if you're like in a state fair type of situation and you've got a whole bunch of jam in the back of a truck and you're ringing up the cash register and handing out bottles of jam to people for a couple of bucks, that's actually illegal work in Canada. If you hire a Canadian person that's going to ring up the sales and all of that stuff, that's fine. You can, hire a student, hire someone to work that afternoon, but you don't want to do delivery of sales. If you, have everything lined up from a tax perspective and you want to conclude an agreement and something's going to ship later from an immigration perspective, that's fine. But you don't actually want to sell the product and deliver the product right in that booth or on that trip.
But piggybacking off of that, so I've seen this happen in the IP perspective. You hire that Canadian person and they go, wow, this jam is great and I'm selling lots of it. And they go and file the trademark application for the jam. And now the US company is going, wait a minute, we're not the owner of the Canadian trademark application. The person that we, thought we hired in Canada is the owner of the trademark. And then you get into a messy opposition and potential trademark infringement claims. So that's why early on, if you know you're going to be selling into Canada as an American company, get your Canadian application filed in your name.
Okay, well, talking about this jam is starting to get me pretty hungry for lunch here. But yeah, you know what? Actually, does the reverse work? So Canadian doing trade show in the US, would a similar law apply then, I assume?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, easy enough, good enough answer. Yeah.
I was going to say that it's pretty consistent between the U.S. and Canada, what you are allowed to do in the U.S. as a business visitor, what you are allowed to do in Canada as a business visitor, before you move into that situation where you do need some type of work authorization or work permit. And so what Des said earlier is absolutely correct. You can come and you can smile and you can, prepare your sales, you can get all that ready to go, but then you get your butt back over the border and then finalize those sales once you're back home and then ship them from at home. And that's usually how we suggest it. And or start getting ready to set up your operations there so that you can get the proper work authorization in place and the proper operations for the purposes of tax and immigration so that you can make those sales directly on site from whatever country it is that you're doing that from.
Oh, and Paul, by the way, with using jam as the example, I mean, we're talking IP, we're talking tax, we're talking immigration. When something is edible, all of a sudden there's a whole whack of Canadian food inspection type of laws that you got to be looking at as well. And if something is going to be sold to a consumer, and you're an American, you got to think about how you're going to label it because there's different labeling laws. There's also a lot of bilingual labeling laws because Canada is a French English bilingual country. So you might have your product all in English, which is fine because that's the way you do it in the US. And in many Canadian jurisdictions, people will read the English and maybe only the English. But sometimes you got to have both the Canadian and the French label on it. And sometimes what you see is, someone actually prints up a label in both languages if you're selling a lot of stuff. A lot of times what you'll see in it, and I'll see it at a store, and I'm sure all of my colleagues will see it as a store, is there's a sticker that's in French that was just clearly just slapped onto the jar or the box just to comply with the language thing. So there's a whole bunch of other issues besides the tax and the intellectual property and the immigration you got to look at.
Okay, no, fantastic addition. Okay, everyone, I don't think there's been any further questions. No hands are up, so we can probably wrap it up there. Thank you so much, David at EDW and the MLT Aikins team. Fantastic webinar, and hopefully everyone got a lot of value. And yeah, we'll end it there today. Thanks so much, everyone.